Do you know the city of Pripyat? Have you ever heard anything about the Chernobyl nuclear power plant? My grandma worked there and she witnessed the explosion that forever changed the world and took the lives of many people. My name is Maria. My grandma's name was Julia. I was born in another country, in a small town where my parents met. My grandma was always a cheerful woman. She often played with me, but she also was very sick. When I grew up, she told me a story from her life, which I will share with you now. As you understand, she was born in Pripyat. It was a glorious city. Life there was calm and quiet. Weddings, parties, the routine of weekdays. Everyone made their plans for the future. Grandma studied as an engineer and got a job at a large company, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The work there was harmful but well paid. My grandma dreamed of earning more money and going abroad. Everything went on as usual, and then she met a guy named Ilya. He tried to get a job at a power plant, but it did not work out, so he went to work at a local factory. They fell in love with each other, got married, got a place, and worked. They did not have children for a long time, and they bought jewelry with the money that they earned and kept it in a secret place. I've been told about this many times. Grandma said that maybe someday someone will find those treasures and her soul will be calm. She did not want it to just disappear under the ground. This idea made me want to go there and see with my own eyes everything that my grandma was talking about. I understood that this was a long and dangerous journey, so I took my friends Sasha and Alessia with me. We said we would be vacationing in Ukraine with Alessia's sister. Since our parents all knew each other, they agreed. We packed the necessities and drove off. Dasha greeted us and gave us rooms in her house and filled the fridge with food. It was very convenient that she was also at work during the day, which meant that we could do anything we wanted. Having carefully studied our maps, we went to look for Pripyat. It took us a long time to get there because we did not find it right away. We kind of got lost. Then I had to ask the locals. Yes, there were still some people there, but in the end we were still not allowed in because of the restrictions. Radiation was still high, despite the fact that almost 30 years have passed and some buildings were still dangerous. We needed to buy a tour and be with a special group under the strict supervision of a guide. There was no choice, so we bought tickets and set off with a small group of tourists. When we got there, a half-dead city was in front of us. To be honest, it was very creepy to see abandoned houses, high-rise buildings that once flourished. My grandma lived in one of those. The most frightening thing was to know that there was still radiation. It could kill like an invisible enemy, come back to haunt you only after a couple of years, or even more. We tried not to touch anything and used a special tool to measure the level of radiation. Many yards were overgrown with grass, and in some playgrounds, toys and bicycles were still laying around. Sometimes I saw old books of which only the covers remained. For a second, I remembered my grandma's story. We stopped at a local hospital. The guide talked about the victims that were hospitalized on that night of the explosion, among whom was my grandma, but she was admitted to the hospital for a different reason. My grandma went to work on one of the most ordinary days. My grandma had just gone on a business trip. She wanted to go home after her shift. It was midnight, but suddenly she saw her colleagues who said that there were some problems with the reactor and perhaps they would have to stay for a while. At that moment, my grandma suddenly felt bad. She felt a sharp pain in her abdomen and then fainted. She was taken to the hospital. When their boss learned that an engineer had just left the station, he was furious, but there was nothing to be done. According to Grandma, when she woke up, the nurse brought her to her senses and asked about her health. The doctors began to examine her. Grandma got scared. She thought that something serious happened, and she was just told that she was pregnant. At that moment, the windows in the hospital trembled and the chandelier swayed. Everyone thought it was just a mild earthquake, but after a couple of hours, the phone rang and the doctors found out that there was an explosion. At that moment, my grandma was given an IV, her blood pressure dropped and she was still in the ward. There was a sudden rush at the hospital. The patients heard screams of pain, torment. They brought in the wounded, the victims of the explosion, among whom were the firefighters. Grandma could not get up and go out, so she listened to what was happening in the corridors. Then she found out that the matter was not all about the fire. People died from radiation exposure. Their clothing was contaminated and organs were infected, and a person died within a matter of days, sometimes even hours. She snatched the catheter out and got to the nearest phone, dialed her husband, but could not get through. She understood very well what was happening because she worked there, but she also understood that she would now become a mother. So the instinct of self-preservation worked, and she ran home, covering her nose and mouth on the way. The hospital in front of which we stood looked more like a cemetery. So many people died within its walls that night, and the worst thing is that the equipment of the firefighters with high radiation was still there. Then the guide took us to a local amusement park, just where my grandma ran after she packed her things. They did not have a phone at home, so she went there to call my grandfather from the street. On the way, she shouted to people to run as soon as possible, but no one listened to her. Everyone thought it was just a simple fire. In the end, my grandma managed to escape the next morning. She came a long way, and everything was to save her child, my mother. And only on the third day after the accident, they officially announced the Chernobyl explosion. The day before, people began to evacuate. Everyone left their home for only 3 days, leaving their belongings, furniture, everything behind. My grandma, however, understood that they were saying goodbye to the city for many, many years, or even forever. The guys and I walked with a dazed look and tried not to touch anything. Then I remembered what Grandma was talking about, her treasures. Sasha and Alessia came up with a plan to escape the guard. When we took a short break with the group and the guide was distracted, we quietly hid in one of the entrances of the apartment buildings, and the group left without us in a couple of minutes. We had some time to find what I was here for. We were lucky that we stopped at the exact address my grandma talked about. We found the house and the apartment where she lived with her husband. The jewelry was supposed to be hidden in a wall in one of the rooms, where they made a secret pocket. We were kind of loud while breaking the concrete in the wall. The hidden jewels looked new. They were still clean and beautiful. I took them out, folded them neatly, and hid them in my bag. Suddenly, Sasha heard a strange noise in the wall. We listened for a minute, and then Alessia shouted, "Let's run!" We quickly ran out of there. Because of our intervention, the old building began to collapse. The walls fell down like a house of cards. Out of fear, we ran out into the streets, and in almost a second, a whole building collapsed by half. My heart pounded in my chest. At that moment, the security and the guide drove up to us, but we lied and said that we got lost while looking for a toilet and that the whole building collapsed by itself. I don't know whether they believed us or not, but they took us away from Pripyat immediately. For the rest of our trip, we felt weird and confused. No, we were not afraid of the building collapsing on us. It was much worse to see how once a beautiful city turned into an abandoned and forgotten place. Believe it or not, people still actually live there. Of course, not everywhere. There's not many of them, but they're still there. And we even saw small tourist shops along the way. And it was not only about the explosion itself, but also about the consequences. My grandma suffered from them. When she managed to escape, they thought everything was over, that everything would now be fine. However, after giving birth, my grandma's condition worsened. At first, everyone could not understand the issue. She always had a stomachache. They diagnosed gastritis, she went through treatment, and after a few years, the pain returned, and now she was told that she had an ulcer, which was also treated. Well, in recent years, we learned that she had cancer. This was a blow to the whole family, but Grandma said that this was to be expected because no matter how fast she ran, the radiation in the air could not be stopped. Everyone breathed that air, so most people from there had to deal with similar consequences. But I fulfilled my promise. My grandma dreamed of taking a last look at her and Grandpa's rings, the earrings that he gave her. When I brought them to her, she was shocked but grateful from the bottom of her heart. On the same day, she went to heaven, but with a light heart and a smile on her face. Tell us in the comments what you know about the Chernobyl, and don't forget to subscribe.